We still do not have a single laboratory test in psychiatry. Because there is always more variability in the results within the mental disorder category than between it and normal or other mental disorders, none of the promising biological findings has ever qualified as a diagnostic test. The brain has provided us no low-hanging fruit. Thousands of studies on hundreds of putative biological markers have so far come up empty. Welcome back. We're doing another psychiatry book today from 2013, Saving Normal. A lot of books critical of psychiatry came out in 2013 because that's when the dsm-iv was published. People had a lot of problems with it, and it's hard to find a more mainstream source than this guy, Alan Francis, because he was the task force chair of the dsm-iv. So he was deeply involved in the creation of these manuals. He acknowledges a lot of factual stuff, but it's kind of all over the place. He sort of yo-yos from acknowledging the absence of legitimate science in this field but still defends the underlying discipline. And so we can perhaps take some issues with that. Although we have learned a great deal about brain functioning, we have not yet figured out ways of translating basic science into clinical psychiatry. The powerful new tools of molecular biology, genetics, and imaging have not yet led to laboratory tests for dementia or depression or schizophrenia or bipolar or obsessive-compulsive disorder or for any other mental disorders. The expectation that there will be a simple gene or neurotransmitter or circuitry explanation for any mental disorder has turned out to be naive and illusory. We still do not have a single laboratory test in psychiatry. Because there is always more variability in the results within the mental disorder category than between it and normal or other mental disorders, none of the promising biological findings has ever qualified as a diagnostic test. The brain has provided us no low-hanging fruit. Thousands of studies on hundreds of putative biological markers have so far come up empty. There's no objectivity in this field in the way that there is in traditional medicine. It's just not there. It doesn't exist. Now, there's a little nitpick I have here. I don't know if you caught it in what he said here that bugs me. If you see my video on Irvin Yalom, in his book, The Gift of Therapy, you know what I'm talking about. Did you catch it? Like Yalom, intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously, what does Francis do? Well, like Yalom, he smuggles in a legitimate neurological issue with all these psych diagnoses that he lists. Did you notice it? Let me read again. Powerful new tools of molecular biology, genetics, and imaging have not yet led to the laboratory test for dementia, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, OCD, and any other mental disorders. Dementia is not a psychiatric diagnosis, it's a neurological disorder. This is a misleading list, just as Yalom did in his list that we quoted, where he mixes psych diagnoses with actual neurological issues, that there is evidence of issues within the brain, lesions within the brain. Alzheimer's, your brain cells are literally dying. So the idea that this is in the same category, that we're limited, just as limited when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's as we are with these psych diagnoses, that's just not accurate. And I know this was published in 2013, and my understanding is that some of the more robust tests for Alzheimer's have only more recently been approved. But there's evidence going back long before that there are lesions in the brain that are related to this. And so the idea that, again, they're in the same category, I just don't think this is a fair portrayal at all. The absence of biological tests is a huge disadvantage for psychiatry. It means that all of our diagnoses are now based on subjective judgments that are inherently fallible and prey to capricious change. It is like having to diagnose pneumonia without having any tests for the viruses or bacteria that cause the various types of lung infection. Inherently fallible, prey to capricious change, subjective judgments. Stuff is arbitrary. Now, Francis will go on to say that no, these categories are still useful. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He takes this sort of middle ground stance. And we're going to quote later where he criticizes the, quote, radicals like me. So he writes, the mental disorders included in dsm-iv have not gained their official status through any rational process of elimination. They made it into the system and have survived because of practical necessity, historical accident, gradual accretion, precedent, and inertia, not because they met some independent set of abstract and universal definitional criteria. So this is just reiterating what I've said. Okay, so here is where Francis takes a shot at the radicals. You know you're going to get a fair hearing when you're described as a radical. So in the under the subheading, Are mental disorders diseases, myths, or something else, he writes, some radical critics of psychiatry have seized on its definitional ambiguities to argue that the profession should not exist at all. They take the difficulty in finding a clear definition of mental disorder as evidence that the concept has no useful meaning. If mental disorders are not anatomically defined medical diseases, they must be myths, and there is no real need to bother diagnosing them. This position is most appealing to libertarians concerned with preserving patient freedom of choice from what they perceive to be the enslaving snares of psychiatry. Saving normal is taken by them to its logical extreme, the extremely illogical position that everyone is normal. This shibboleth can be believed only by armchair theorists with no real life experience in having, living with, or treating mental illness. However difficult to define, psychiatric disorder is an all too painful reality for those who suffer from it and for those who care about them. Saving normal, as I use the term, is not meant to deny the value of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. Rather, it is an effort to keep psychiatry doing what it does well within its appropriate limits. It is equally dangerous at either extreme to have either an expanding concept of mental disorder that eliminates normal or to have an expanding concept of normal that eliminates mental disorder. He makes this claim that this view is most appealing to libertarians, and he's probably referring to someone like Thomas Szasz or Peter Breggin, who are probably the greatest critics that have ever lived when it comes to pointing out psychiatry's pseudo-scientific underpinnings. But you can find loads of people on the left, socialists, outright socialists, that think exactly the same, that think this psychiatric model is complete nonsense. A bunch of the most contemporary critics, most prominent critics of psychiatry are the British guys. British professors, researchers, and intellectuals. And a bunch of them are lefties. Hardcore lefties, socialists. And that's actually, it's a positive thing to see that. Whenever you can see a similar conclusion drawn by people on different ends of the political spectrum, that's an indication that the criticisms are probably legitimate. Because if these two groups disagree, have extremely different views on politics, yet they come to the same conclusion about some scientific debate, well, that is, again, it's not proof, but it's a good sign that there's something more, there's something real here in terms of what they have to criticize. And it's not just a partisan issue. If everyone that criticized psychiatry was a libertarian, it was only libertarians, or if it was only socialists, we could maybe more easily question their motives, but we don't see that. So then he does a straw man. He says, saving normal is taken by them to its logical extreme. The extremely illogical position that everyone is normal. This is, I think, an unfair characterization. If people want to define certain experiences as problematic or abnormal or dysfunctional, or they want to use mental illness as a metaphor, they're free to do that. Critics, including people like Zaz Breggin, it's not that they just think all of this stuff is imaginary and it's all made up and it's not real. We all acknowledge that the experiences themselves have legitimacy often. Now, there's a category of malingering, which is a separate issue we don't have to get into, but putting that aside, people experience a lot of the things that are represented by these categories of mental disorder, like hearing voices or paranoia or low mood, anxiety, obsessive behaviors, difficulties in paying attention. I've said this before, all these experiences are legitimate experiences. They're part of the human condition. But we allow the individual to determine whether it's an issue for them, not some anointed intellectual they've never met. So it's not so much the question of normal or abnormal, it's kind of immaterial. We don't need to make an argument that everything is normal. We just accept that you don't necessarily have the right to determine that for someone else and then coerce them into, quote, treatment because they meet your definition of abnormality. That's the issue. And he acknowledges in the book that this stuff has been used to persecute people in all areas of the globe. So it's a weapon that has been abused. So just to reiterate, the experiences are legitimate. If people have an issue and they want to change something, they don't like that they're feeling low, or they don't like that they're paranoid or getting into problematic relationships, or they can't focus, then they are free to try and address those problems. And if they consider them abnormal or dysfunctional, that's for them to determine. And they're no less qualified, again, given what Alan Francis just acknowledged, that it's just subjective judgments, capricious change, arbitrary. He uses these words. So the idea that, so why cannot the individual determine this for himself? Is his subjective judgment really any less valid? So this is a big topic that deserves its own video, but just one of the core issues with psychiatry is that it presumes the right, demands the authority to enforce its so-called treatments against people's will, which is just an insane amount of power to just bestow upon a medical professional or the field as a whole. And traditional medicine does not get this privilege. You're dying of cancer, you don't want chemo, no one can force you to take it. But he then goes on to reiterate that after spending, that we don't have much from all the research we've done. He says, billions of research dollars have failed to produce convincing evidence that any mental disorder is a discrete disease entity with a unitary cause. Dozens of different candidate genes have been found, but in follow-up studies each turned out to be fool's gold. So all this hype around genes, what a waste. Thomas Insel has acknowledged this as well. But then, and this is where the flip-flopping is, it's just really all over the place. He'll again say things like this: mental disorders are not myths. Though not a discrete disease entity, like say a brain tumor or a stroke, schizophrenia produces profound and prolonged dis-ease, that is, distress and incapacity. The patterns of its presentation are clearly recognizable, can be reliably diagnosed, run in families, have brain imaging correlates, predict course, and respond to specific treatments. Schizophrenia is real enough, and no psychiatric invention for those who suffer from it and for their loved ones. He says it's not a discrete disease entity, but then a moment later he says it produces distress and incapacity. So it's an entity that is causing some distress in the person. So you are treating it as an entity. You're acknowledging that you don't have the data to actually point to it and say, oh, that's what causes it. Like we can do with actual neurological issues. We can point in the brain and say that lesion is responsible for your symptoms. Now he'll say, we have brain imaging correlates. What does that mean? He's already acknowledged that there's no lab test for this stuff. So whatever brain imaging correlates means, it doesn't inform diagnosis. Again, we acknowledge that the experiences of people that are labeled schizophrenic can be legitimate. People can experience hearing voices. They can experience paranoia. They can experience perceptions that are at odds with reality. You can acknowledge that without labeling them in this way. And the reliability question is a red herring. Talked about this in a speech a long time ago. Without validity, reliability is irrelevant. Even if you're at 100% reliability. If I show you a series of images of depictions of unicorns, I bet we could agree 100%. So our reliability is perfect in terms of our ability to distinguish between a unicorn and a non-unicorn. Does that prove, does that demonstrate, does that provide any evidence that unicorns exist? Nope. Same thing here. Our classification of mental disorders is no more than a collection of fallible and limited constructs that seeks but never finds the truth. But this remains our best current way of communicating about, treating, and researching mental disorders. Schizophrenia is a useful construct, not myth, not disease. It is a description of a particular set of psychiatric problems, not an explanation of their cause. Someday we will have a much more accurate understanding and more precise ways of describing these same problems. But for now, schizophrenia is very valuable in our day-to-day work, and so are the other DSM disorders. It is good to know and use the DSM definitions, but not to reify or worship them. Schizophrenia is sort of the sacred cow in psychiatry. It's often the one that's invoked because people associate it most readily with insanity, basically. And so it's often the fallback when these other diagnoses don't seem as real. So he acknowledges it's not a disease, but he says it's not a myth too. And again, we acknowledge that some of the, quote, symptoms, the phenomena that overlap with this label are real. But again, the criteria, I think John Reed spoke about this a long time ago when he was referring to the DSM-IV criteria, and that you can have two, quote, schizophrenics that share almost nothing, if not none of the same symptoms, but they're both considered schizophrenics. You better not tell Bruce Perry this, Dr. Francis. If you watch my video on the myth of normal, the book by Gabor Mate, where he quotes or interviews Bruce Perry and quotes him, Bruce Perry talks about ADHD and how they've not used these diagnoses for decades. And then he doesn't believe they're any worse at treating, quote, treating or working with, helping people that suffer from these attentional issues. And arguably that they do a better job now. Francis writes, there is really nothing magical or preordained about any of the DSM thresholds. Shades of grey exist between their seemingly black and white cutoff points, requiring 5 symptoms and 2 weeks for major depressive disorder derives from a fairly arbitrary choice, not a scientific necessity. He goes on to say, just as easily, the set points could have been set higher, say at 6 symptoms and 4 weeks. So you've just classified a bunch of people as depressed, when if you just alter this one variable, your net, the net you cast would have been different. People want to study the biological causes of something like depression based on this kind of thing. It's just junk science. Okay, and finally, yeah, he acknowledges that, so when a new version of the DSM comes out, they do these field trials to assess the reliability of the diagnoses. And they can give a misleading or inflated view of how reliable they are. Again, reliability is a red herring, doesn't even matter, but just to play along here. So the statistics, the kappa scores you get from these field trials are like the best you can hope for. And odds are in the real world it's going to be much lower. So you got to take these with a grain of salt. Francis acknowledges here, patient selection in a field trial also artificially raises reliability. In real life, making a diagnosis is like finding a needle in a haystack containing hundreds of possible choices. The field test presents a much easier challenge to the clinician. He knows he is selecting from among only a handful of different choices. Bottom line, field trials are absolutely necessary but extremely fallible. Very different take to that of Bruce Perry, who, as I quoted before, doesn't rely on this stuff and he still manages to help people. Just to reiterate one more time, criticizing the field and the diagnostic model is not a refutation or denial of the underlying experiences. That stuff can all be legitimate. You just don't need to rely on or frame it as a disease or a disorder to take it seriously. And that the individual, ideally, should be free to determine what is a behavior or experience that is abnormal to them or that they dislike and that they would like to change, not some anointed expert